You just hit me.
You were being insubordinate. You pulled away from a teacher.
So you hit me?
The sound of a hand striking skin echoes through a high school gymnasium. A 16-year-old black girl staggers backward, her hand flying to her cheek. Her eyes are wide with shock, glistening with tears she refuses to let fall. Around her, 30 students stand frozen, mouths open, some with phones still recording. The man who just struck her, a middle-aged white PE teacher in a Westridge High polo shirt, is breathing hard, his face red with rage. But in that frozen moment you can see it, the flash of recognition crossing his features. The realization that he's just made a catastrophic mistake. This PE teacher just made the biggest mistake of his career. And he has absolutely no idea just how big that mistake really is. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back. Back to 3 hours earlier, before the slap heard around the district, before the videos went viral, before everything changed. We need to go back to a quiet Tuesday morning, to a silver sedan parked outside Westridge High School, where a young woman sat trying to calm her nerves before walking into her new life. Maya Thompson was 16 years old, and this was supposed to be her fresh start. She sat in the passenger seat of her mother's car, staring at the sprawling brick building in front of her. Westridge High. A public school. So different from the private academy she'd attended since kindergarten, with its manicured lawns and uniformed students. Maya had asked for this transfer, practically begged for it because she was tired of being in a bubble. Tired of the pretense, the superficiality, the feeling that she was being kept separate from the real world. She wanted authenticity. She wanted to be treated like a normal teenager, not like someone special because of who her family was. Her mother, Dr. Patricia Thompson, sat in the driver's seat, one hand on the steering wheel, the other reaching over to squeeze Maya's. Patricia was an elegant woman in her early 40s, wearing a crisp navy suit that spoke of authority and success. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and behind her designer glasses, her eyes were filled with a mixture of pride and concern as she looked at her daughter. Maya could feel her mother's hesitation, the unspoken worry radiating from her. And she understood it. Patricia had worked her entire career to get to where she was, the first black woman to serve as superintendent of the entire district. It was a position she'd started just 2 weeks ago, and already the pressure was immense. The politics, the scrutiny, the weight of representation. And now her daughter wanted to attend one of the district's schools, wanted to be anonymous, wanted Patricia to hide who she was. Patricia's voice was soft but firm. She told Maya that she was proud of her, that she admired her desire to experience life beyond privilege. But she also warned her that the world wasn't always fair, wasn't always kind. That sometimes people would judge her before they knew her, would make assumptions based on nothing but what they saw. Patricia had spent a lifetime navigating those assumptions, those microaggressions, those moments where she had to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. She didn't want that for her daughter. She wanted to protect her. But Maya was determined. She looked at her mother with those intelligent, thoughtful eyes, so much like Patricia's own, and she made her case. She explained that she needed to understand the schools her mother now oversaw, needed to see them from the inside as a student, not as the superintendent's daughter receiving special treatment. She promised she'd be careful, that she'd call if anything went wrong. And then she asked the question that Patricia had been dreading: would her mother keep her identity secret? Would she let Maya just be Maya Thompson, regular transfer student, and not Maya Thompson, daughter of the new superintendent? Patricia closed her eyes for a moment. Every instinct screamed at her to say no, to protect her child, to let the school know exactly who Maya was so they'd treat her with the respect she deserved. But she also understood her daughter's need for independence, for authenticity. So she reluctantly agreed. She would keep the secret at least for now. But she made Maya promise to text her throughout the day, to let her know how things were going. And if anything at all felt wrong, Maya was to call immediately. Maya nodded, grabbing her backpack. As she opened the car door, Patricia called out one more thing. She told her daughter to remember who she was, not the superintendent's daughter, not a symbol, not a representative of anything. Just Maya. Smart, kind, strong Maya. To carry herself with the dignity and grace she'd always shown, and to never, ever let anyone make her feel less than she was. Maya smiled back at her mother, a mixture of confidence and nervousness playing across her young face. Then she closed the door and walked toward Westridge High, her head held high, her shoulders back, carrying herself with a quiet dignity that came not from arrogance but from self-assurance. She was intelligent, brilliant, actually, with straight A's and a particular gift for mathematics and literature. She was athletic, a former track star who'd set records at her private school. But more than anything, she was thoughtful and reserved, the kind of person who observed before she spoke, who listened before she judged. She didn't seek attention, didn't need to be the center of anything. She just wanted to be seen for who she really was. If you're already invested in Maya's story and want to see where this goes, hit that subscribe button now because what happens next is going to shock you. While Maya was walking through those front doors with hope and determination, someone else was starting their day at Westridge High. Someone who had been there for 18 years, who knew every corner of that building, who had a very different worldview than the young woman about to enter his sphere. Coach Derek Mitchell was 42 years old, and he was a creature of habit. Every morning was the same routine. He arrived at school at 6:30 a.m., a full hour before any students, carrying his protein shake in one hand and his duffel bag in the other. He was a tall man, about 6'2", with the build of someone who'd been athletic in his youth and was desperately trying to maintain it in middle age. His hair was cut military short, graying at the temples, and he had the kind of square jaw and intense stare that intimidated teenagers. He wore the same thing every day: khaki shorts, a Westridge High polo shirt tucked in, a whistle around his neck, and white athletic shoes that were always immaculately clean. Mitchell strutted through the hallways like he owned them, and in many ways he felt like he did. 18 years. 18 years at Westridge High, teaching physical education, coaching basketball and track, shaping young minds, or at least that's how he saw it. Other teachers who passed him in those early morning hours would nod, offer a cautious good morning, but there was something in their eyes. A wariness, a carefulness. They respected him, or at least they respected his tenure and his reputation. But they were also a little afraid of him. Mitchell's coaching philosophy was what he called old school. No participation trophies, no coddling, no safe spaces. He believed in discipline, in pushing students beyond their comfort zones, in making them tough. He'd grown up in an era where coaches yelled, where punishment drills were standard, where you didn't question authority. And he genuinely believed that today's students were soft, that they'd been ruined by helicopter parents and social media and this new culture of sensitivity. In his mind, he was doing them a favor by preparing them for the real world. But there was something else beneath that philosophy, something Mitchell himself might not have even fully recognized. It showed in small moments, in the way he interacted with different students. The white students, particularly the boys, got "son" and "champ" and pats on the back. They got second chances, got patient explanations, got the benefit of the doubt. But students of color? They got a harder edge. Sharper criticism. Less patience. Higher expectations with less support. Mitchell would have denied any prejudice if confronted. He would have pointed to the one or two minority students he'd mentored over the years as proof of his fairness. But patterns don't lie, and the pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. He was respected by some parents, particularly those who shared his worldview, who appreciated his no-nonsense approach and his emphasis on discipline. They saw him as a counterbalance to what they perceived as an increasingly permissive culture. But students? Students feared him. They dreaded PE class, dreaded his whistle, dreaded the way he could humiliate you in front of your peers if you didn't perform to his standards. And they learned quickly: keep your head down, do exactly what he says, and pray you don't become his target for the day. As Mitchell walked through the empty hallways that Tuesday morning, sipping his protein shake, he had no idea that his entire world was about to collapse. That a 16-year-old girl was about to walk through those doors and change everything. He was just thinking about the day ahead, about the basketball drills he'd planned, about which students he'd need to push harder. Just another day. Just another group of soft kids who needed toughening up. But it wasn't going to be just another day. Not even close. Maya's first few periods at Westridge High went surprisingly well. She navigated the crowded hallways with the same quiet confidence she'd shown walking out of her mother's car. The building was so different from her old school. More crowded, more diverse, more alive in a way that felt authentic to her. Students of every background filled the corridors, their voices creating a symphony of different languages, different styles, different stories. In her second period English class, Maya met Jasmine Rodriguez, a petite girl with bright eyes and an immediate warmth that put Maya at ease. Jasmine had claimed the desk next to Maya's before the bell even rang, introducing herself with an enthusiasm that was infectious. By the time class started, they were already trading stories, and by the time it ended, Jasmine had appointed herself as Maya's unofficial guide to Westridge High. As they walked toward third period together, Jasmine asked the inevitable question: where did Maya transfer from? Maya kept it vague. A private school across town, wanted a change, nothing dramatic. Jasmine accepted this easily, already moving on to what she clearly thought was more important information. She needed to warn Maya about the social dynamics of Westridge, about which teachers were cool and which were nightmares, about where to sit at lunch and where to avoid. And then Jasmine's voice dropped low, taking on a serious tone. She needed to warn Maya about Coach Mitchell. Her face became somber as she described him. The excessive punishment drills that left students vomiting, the humiliation tactics he employed if you missed a shot or dropped a ball, the way he seemed particularly harsh with certain students. Jasmine didn't say it outright, but the implication was clear. If you were black or Latino, if you were anything other than white, you were going to have a harder time in Mitchell's class. Maya listened carefully, filing this information away. She'd encountered teachers like this before, though never quite so blatant. She asked Jasmine if anyone had ever complained, ever reported him. Jasmine laughed bitterly. Of course people had complained. Students, parents, even some teachers. But nothing ever happened. Mitchell had been there forever, had tenure, had allies in the administration. He was untouchable. As if summoned by their conversation, Coach Mitchell himself appeared in the hallway ahead of them. He had a young Latino student pressed against the lockers, not physically, but with the force of his presence and his voice. The boy looked terrified, maybe 14 years old, and Mitchell was barking at him about something. The words drifted down the hallway. Something about proper English, about speaking clearly, about showing respect. The boy was stammering an apology, his accent thick, his eyes downcast. Mitchell's finger was pointed in his face, his voice getting louder. Maya felt something tighten in her chest as she watched. Other students were giving the scene a wide berth, hurrying past with their heads down, not wanting to get involved. Teachers who passed looked uncomfortable but kept walking. Maya wanted to intervene, every instinct telling her this was wrong, but Jasmine grabbed her arm and pulled her along. That was rule number 1 at Westridge, Jasmine whispered urgently. You don't get involved with Coach Mitchell. You stay invisible. You survive. Maya looked back over her shoulder as they turned the corner, watching the Latino student's shoulders shake. She made a mental note. She would remember this moment. The rest of Maya's morning continued smoothly. Her teachers were impressed with her. She answered questions thoughtfully in history, solved complex equations effortlessly in algebra, contributed meaningfully to discussions in science. More than one teacher asked about her background, clearly curious about this articulate, intelligent new student who'd appeared mid-semester. Maya deflected politely, giving just enough information to satisfy curiosity without revealing anything substantial. She was getting good at this, at being simultaneously present and invisible. She met Vice Principal Karen Webster briefly when getting her locker assignment. Webster was a woman in her 50s with helmet hair and a tight smile, the kind of administrator who seemed more concerned with maintaining order than with actual education. There was something in the way Webster looked at Maya, a quick assessment that felt clinical, categorizing. Maya couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something about the woman made her uneasy. Principal Tom Henderson, on the other hand, barely registered Maya's existence. She saw him in the hallway between classes, a balding man in his 60s who looked like he was counting down the days to retirement. He shuffled past students without making eye contact, his shoulders slightly stooped, already checked out. Maya recognized the type, someone who'd given up on making waves, who just wanted to get through each day without incident. And then came last period. Physical education. The class Maya had been both looking forward to and dreading based on everything Jasmine had told her. She'd been a track star at her previous school, had set records in the 100 and 200-meter dashes, had genuinely loved the feeling of pushing her body to its limits. But now, as she changed in the locker room surrounded by nervous students, she felt the tension in the air. The girls around her were talking in low voices about Coach Mitchell, sharing strategies for staying under his radar. Don't make eye contact. Don't talk back. Don't stand out. Just blend in and survive. Maya listened quietly, tying her athletic shoes, pulling her braids back into a ponytail. She'd never been good at making herself small, at hiding her abilities. It went against everything her mother had taught her about carrying herself with dignity, about being proud of her gifts. But she also understood survival. She would try to find the balance. The gymnasium was huge, with polished wooden floors and championship banners hanging from the rafters. Coach Mitchell stood at center court, whistle around his neck, clipboard in hand, looking every bit the authoritarian figure Jasmine had described. Students filed in and lined up without being told, a Pavlovian response to his presence. Maya found a spot at the end of the line, trying not to draw attention. Mitchell's voice boomed across the gymnasium as he called attendance. Each name was met with a quick "here" or "present," students' voices small in response to his commanding presence. Then he reached Maya's name. Thompson Maya. He paused, looking up from his clipboard, his eyes scanning the line until they found her. There was something in that pause, in the way his gaze traveled over her, assessing, categorizing. His lip curled slightly, not quite a sneer but close. "New girl," he said, his voice carrying across the gym. "Let's see what you've got." It wasn't a welcome. It was a challenge. The class activity was basketball, drills first, then a scrimmage game. Mitchell demonstrated the drills himself, his movements still athletic despite his age, clearly taking pride in his own physical ability. Students were divided into groups, and Maya found herself going through the motions of layup drills, defensive slides, passing exercises. And despite her intention to blend in, despite her plan to stay under the radar, her natural athleticism betrayed her. She moved with a grace and confidence that came from years of serious athletics. Her footwork was precise, her shots smooth and accurate, her defensive stance textbook perfect. She couldn't help it. Sports were where she felt most herself, most free. And one by one, other students started noticing. Started passing to her more often. Started looking impressed. Coach Mitchell noticed too. Maya could feel his eyes on her as she executed a perfect jump shot, as she stole the ball during a defensive drill, as she assisted teammates with encouraging words and tactical suggestions. And with each success, with each moment where she stood out, she could see his expression darkening, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing. When it came time for the scrimmage, Mitchell divided them into two teams. Maya's natural leadership emerged as she called plays, set up her teammates, played smart basketball that wasn't about showing off but about genuine teamwork. She scored, yes, but she also assisted. She defended without fouling. She communicated with her team. And her team was winning because of it. Mitchell paced the sideline, his whistle ready, but he couldn't call fouls that weren't there. He couldn't penalize excellence. But Maya could feel his attention on her like a weight, like pressure building. She'd seen this before in other contexts. People who couldn't handle being challenged, who saw competence as a threat rather than something to nurture. Across the court, Travis Henderson, a large white student who played with more aggression than skill, was getting frustrated. He was used to being the star of the class, used to Coach Mitchell's praise and patience. But now there was this new girl, this black girl, making him look clumsy by comparison. And she wasn't even trying to show him up. She was just playing basketball. What would you do if you were Maya in this moment? Would you dim your light to avoid conflict, or would you continue to shine and face whatever consequences came? Drop your answer in the comments below. Maya had no idea that in just a few minutes, her excellence, her refusal to make herself small, was going to trigger a chain of events that would change not just her life, but the entire school district. She had no idea that Coach Mitchell's darkening expression was a warning sign of something explosive about to happen. She was just playing basketball, being herself, doing what came naturally. And sometimes that's all it takes to expose the truth. The scrimmage continued and Maya was in her element. She moved across that polished gymnasium floor like she'd been born on a basketball court, which in many ways she had been. Her father had played college ball before he passed away when she was 8, and he taught her to love the game, not the glory or the attention, but the pure joy of movement, strategy, teamwork. Every dribble, every pass, every shot carried his memory with it. She scored again, a clean jumper from the elbow that swished through the net without touching the rim. Her teammates cheered, high-fiving her as they ran back on defense. Then she assisted on the next possession, a perfect bounce pass that led to an easy layup. Then she scored again on a fast break, her speed leaving defenders behind. It wasn't showboating. It wasn't arrogance. It was just Maya playing the game the way she knew how, with intelligence, skill, and a genuine love for the sport. But Coach Mitchell's voice cut through the gymnasium like a knife. "Slow down, hotshot." His tone was sharp, dripping with sarcasm. "This isn't street ball." The comment hung in the air and several students exchanged glances. Street ball. Everyone knew what he was really saying, what he was implying. Maya felt the sting of it, felt the racist undertone that Mitchell had wrapped in seemingly innocent coaching advice. But she didn't react. She didn't give him the satisfaction. She just nodded, tucked the comment away in her memory and continued playing. But she didn't slow down. She couldn't. To slow down would be to make herself less, to diminish her abilities to make someone else comfortable, and that was something her mother had taught her never to do. So she kept playing her game, fair, competitive, smart. She set up her teammates, called out defensive assignments, encouraged the quieter students to take shots. And something remarkable started happening. Other students began gravitating toward her, responding to her leadership, playing better because she made them believe they could. Mitchell watched this shift with growing irritation. He was supposed to be the leader in this gymnasium. He was supposed to be the one students looked to. But here was this new girl, this 16-year-old who'd been in his class for all of 30 minutes, and she was commanding more respect than he was. It gnawed at him, this loss of control, this challenge to his authority that wasn't even intentional, which somehow made it worse. He blew his whistle sharply, stopping play. Time to switch things up, he announced. New teams. And as he called out names, pairing students deliberately, Maya heard her name called alongside Travis Henderson. She was being assigned to guard him and he would guard her. Travis was the kind of student who thrived under Mitchell's coaching style. He was big, about 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds, with a build that was more suited to football than basketball. But his father was on the school board, and Travis had grown up hearing that aggression and dominance were the measures of manhood. On the court, he played with an almost reckless physicality, throwing elbows, using his size to intimidate smaller players. And Coach Mitchell had always praised him for it, calling it toughness, calling it competitive fire. The scrimmage resumed, and Travis immediately tried to establish dominance. He pushed Maya on the first possession, using his body to create space, his elbow coming back hard into her ribs. She absorbed the contact, stayed on her feet, played through it. On offense, when Maya had the ball, Travis overplayed her, his hands grabbing at her jersey, his shoulder checking her. It was beyond physical play, it was targeted aggression. And Maya handled it with grace, using her quickness and skill to get around him without retaliating. But Travis was getting frustrated. He wasn't used to being outplayed, especially not by a girl, especially not by someone smaller than him. On the next possession, as Maya drove past him for a layup, Travis stuck his elbow out deliberately. It caught Maya square in the side of her head, a vicious shot that had nothing to do with basketball. The impact sent her stumbling sideways, her hand flying to her temple, stars exploding in her vision. She caught herself against the wall, breathing hard, the world spinning for a moment. The gymnasium went quiet. Students had seen it. Everyone had seen it. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't incidental contact. It was a deliberate elbow to the head of another player. In any reasonable coaching situation, Travis would have been benched immediately, would have been reprimanded, possibly even sent to the principal's office. But this wasn't a reasonable coaching situation. Coach Mitchell's whistle blew, but not at Travis. Thompson. His voice boomed across the gym. Toughen up. No crying in my gym. Maya straightened slowly, her hand still at her temple, checking for blood. There wasn't any, but the spot throbbed with pain that would definitely leave a bruise. She took a breath, steadying herself, and then looked directly at Coach Mitchell. Her voice was calm, measured, carrying across the silent gymnasium. I wasn't going to cry, Coach. It was a simple statement, factual, not defiant. But something about her composure, her refusal to be diminished, made Mitchell's jaw tighten. His face flushed red, and for just a moment, something dangerous flashed in his eyes. This girl wasn't intimidated. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't playing the role he'd expected her to play. And that made her a problem. Mitchell blew his whistle again, calling for a water break. Students scattered to the sidelines, grabbing their water bottles, their voices low as they processed what they'd just witnessed. Maya walked slowly to her spot, her head still throbbing, and Jasmine immediately rushed over to her, concern written across her face. Jasmine's voice was barely above a whisper, urgent and worried. She told Maya she needed to keep her head down, needed to stop standing out, needed to just survive this class. Didn't Maya see what was happening? Coach Mitchell had targeted her, had decided she was a problem, and when he decided that, things got bad. Really bad. Jasmine had seen it happen before with other students, particularly students of color who didn't know their place in his hierarchy. Maya took a long drink of water, her eyes distant. She'd heard Jasmine, understood the warning, appreciated the concern. But something in her couldn't just comply, couldn't just make herself small and invisible. It went against everything she'd been taught, everything she believed about dignity and self-worth. She thanked Jasmine quietly, promised she'd be careful, but she couldn't promise to disappear. As Maya stood there, she noticed something that made her stomach turn. Coach Mitchell was talking to Travis, and his tone was completely different. Gentle. Patient. Almost fatherly. He had his hand on Travis's shoulder, talking to him in low tones, and then Maya heard it clearly. That's all right, son. Good effort. Keep that aggressive energy. That's what I like to see. Travis hadn't been reprimanded. Hadn't been corrected. Hadn't even been told to be more careful. Instead, he was being praised for the same aggressive play that had just sent Maya stumbling into a wall with a possible concussion. The contrast was so stark, so undeniable that several other students noticed it too. Whispers spread along the sideline. Did you hear that? He's praising Travis for elbowing her in the head. This is insane. Maya watched this interaction with a growing understanding. This wasn't just about coaching styles or old-school discipline. This was about something deeper, something more insidious. Coach Mitchell had different standards for different students, and those standards seemed to correlate directly with the color of their skin. Travis, white and aggressive, was praised for behavior that would have gotten Maya or Jasmine or any of the other minority students in serious trouble. The water break ended and Mitchell's whistle cut through the conversations. Next drill, he announced. Suicide runs. For those who don't know, suicides are a brutal conditioning drill where you sprint to the free throw line and back, then to half court and back, then to the far free throw line and back, then full court and back, touching each line as you go. They're designed to push you to your absolute limit, to test your cardiovascular endurance and mental toughness. Students lined up on the baseline and at Mitchell's whistle, they took off. Maya's track background kicked in immediately. She had perfect running form, controlled breathing, efficient movement. She touched each line precisely, her hands slapping the floor at every marker, then exploding back in the opposite direction. Other students were already laboring by the half-court mark, but Maya looked like she was just warming up. She crossed the finish line first, a good 5 seconds ahead of the next student, and she was barely winded. Her breathing was elevated but controlled, her face showing exertion but not exhaustion. She'd run much harder workouts than this at her previous school. This was nothing. Coach Mitchell stared at her, his face unreadable. Then he blew his whistle. Thompson. Again. You cut the corner. Maya's eyebrows raised slightly. She hadn't cut any corner. She'd touched every single line, had been meticulous about it because she knew Mitchell was watching her. But she wasn't about to argue, except Mitchell was making an accusation that was demonstrably false, and something in Maya couldn't let that stand without at least stating the truth. Her voice was respectful but firm. Coach, I touched every line. The gymnasium had gone quiet again, students sensing another confrontation brewing. And then something remarkable happened. Several students spoke up, confirming that Maya had done the drill correctly. Yeah, coach, she touched all the lines. I was right behind her, she did it right. She definitely touched every line, coach. For a moment, Mitchell seemed taken aback by this show of solidarity. But then his face hardened and his voice rose to a shout. Don't talk back to me. I don't care what you think you saw. When I say you cut a corner, you cut a corner. 50 push-ups. Now, it was a power play, pure and simple. Mitchell knew Maya had done the drill correctly. The students knew it. Probably Mitchell himself knew it. But he was the authority figure and he was demanding compliance regardless of truth. He was testing to see if Maya would break, would push back, would give him a reason to escalate further. Maya looked at him for a long moment. Then, without a word, she dropped to the floor in push-up position. Her form was perfect. Back straight, core tight, full range of motion. She began counting out loud. 1, 2, 3. Each push-up was controlled and precise. No struggling, no shortcuts. 10, 15, 20. Other students watched in amazement. Most of them would have been shaking by push-up 20, but Maya looked like she could do this all day. Coach Mitchell watched her, his frustration mounting with each perfect push-up. She was supposed to struggle. She was supposed to complain, to fail, to give him ammunition to berate her further. But she was doing the exact opposite. She was showing him that his punishment was meaningless, that she was stronger than he'd anticipated, that she wouldn't break. 30, 35, 40. Maya's voice remained steady, her form never wavering. She reached 50 and held the top position, looking up at Mitchell, waiting for permission to stand. He glared at her, his jaw working, and then jerked his head in dismissal. She stood smoothly, not even breathing particularly hard, and walked back to the baseline without a word. If you're seeing how toxic this situation is becoming and you want to see justice served, hit that subscribe button right now because what happens next is going to blow your mind. The atmosphere in the gymnasium had shifted. Students were no longer just nervous, they were angry. They'd witnessed blatant unfairness, had seen their coach lie about what happened, had watched him punish a student for excellence rather than failure. And Maya, with her quiet dignity and refusal to be broken, was becoming something of a hero in their eyes. She hadn't been disrespectful. She hadn't fought back. She'd simply maintained her composure and proven she was stronger than the punishment meant to humiliate her. Mitchell knew he was losing control of the class, losing the fear-based respect he'd cultivated over 18 years. And that made him dangerous. Because people who rely on fear and authority don't respond well when that authority is questioned, even implicitly. They escalate. They double down. They look for opportunities to reassert dominance. The basketball scrimmage resumed, and Maya's team was winning decisively. But she wasn't dominating the ball or showing off. She was playing smart team basketball, making the extra pass, setting screens, playing solid defense. Her leadership was subtle but effective, and her teammates responded to it. Even students who'd been timid before were now taking shots, playing with more confidence, because Maya's presence had shifted the dynamic of the entire class. Travis Henderson was having the worst game of his life. He was being outplayed by a girl who was 6 inches shorter and 70 pounds lighter than him, and he couldn't handle it. Every time he tried to post up, Maya's teammate would front him, cutting off the passing lane. Every time he tried to drive, Maya would help on defense, stripping the ball or forcing a bad shot. And worst of all, his teammates had stopped passing to him as much because they'd figured out that passing to Maya's side of the court led to better results. His frustration had been building all period and had finally reached a breaking point. Maya had just assisted on another basket, a beautiful behind-the-back pass that led to an easy score, and her team was celebrating. As they transitioned back on defense, Travis was bringing the ball up the court, and Maya positioned herself to defend. She wasn't pressing him, wasn't being aggressive, just playing solid positional defense. But Travis had had enough. As he drove toward the basket, instead of trying to shoot around Maya, he lowered his shoulder and shoved her with both hands violently with all his weight behind it. It wasn't a basketball play. It was an assault. Maya flew backward, her feet leaving the ground, her arms pinwheeling as she tried to catch her balance. She crashed hard onto the polished wooden floor, sliding several feet before coming to a stop near the out-of-bounds line. The impact drove the air from her lungs. Pain exploded in her knee as it scraped across the floor, the skin tearing open, blood immediately welling up and dripping onto the pristine gymnasium floor. For a moment, Maya just lay there, stunned, the world spinning above her. Then she assessed the damage. Her knee was bleeding badly, the scrape deep enough that she could see it would leave a scar. Her hip throbbed where it had hit the floor. Her hands stung from trying to catch herself. But Maya was an athlete, and athletes learn to play through pain. She took a breath, planted her hands on the floor and pushed herself up. The movement sent a sharp pain through her knee, and she could feel blood running down her shin, soaking into her sock. But she stood, tested her weight on the leg, determined that nothing was broken or sprained. She could keep playing. She would keep playing. But before she could even fully straighten, Coach Mitchell's whistle blew, sharp and accusatory. "Thompson, stop being dramatic." Maya's head snapped up, shock written across her face. Dramatic? She'd just been violently shoved to the ground, was actively bleeding, and she was being accused of being dramatic? She looked down at her knee, at the blood dripping onto the floor, then back at Mitchell. Her voice was calm despite the pain, despite the absurdity of the accusation. "Coach, I'm fine. Can I just get a bandage?" It was a reasonable request. A basic safety protocol. Any coach in any school in America would immediately send a bleeding student to the nurse, would stop play to make sure the injured party was okay, would address the student who'd committed what was obviously a flagrant foul. But Coach Mitchell wasn't any coach. He was a coach who'd already decided Maya was a problem, and now he saw an opportunity to paint her as a troublemaker. His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "You trying to get Travis in trouble? I saw you flop." The accusation was so absurd that for a moment, Maya couldn't even process it. Flop? She'd been shoved so hard she'd flown through the air. There were 30 witnesses. The sound of her body hitting the floor had echoed through the gymnasium. And he was claiming she'd flopped, had faked it, was trying to get Travis in trouble? Her voice came out confused, almost pleading for sanity. "What? He pushed me. It's fine, accidents happen, but I'm actually bleeding." She gestured to her knee, to the blood that was now pooling in her shoe, hoping that physical evidence would override whatever narrative Mitchell was trying to construct. But she'd underestimated just how far Mitchell was willing to go, just how much he'd committed to his warped perception of the situation. His face was red now, a vein throbbing in his temple as he shouted across the gymnasium. "I know what I saw. Your kind always trying to play victim." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just been dropped. The entire gymnasium went silent. Not the nervous silence from earlier, but a shocked, horrified silence. Students froze mid-motion. Mouths fell open. Eyes went wide. Because Coach Mitchell had just said the quiet part out loud. "You're kind." Everyone knew exactly what he meant, what group he was referring to, what racist stereotype he was invoking. Maya felt like she'd been slapped. Her eyes widened, her breath caught in her throat. She stared at Mitchell, unable to believe he'd actually said that he'd actually crossed that line so openly, so boldly. Her voice came out barely above a whisper, but in that silent gymnasium, everyone heard it. My kind? For just a split second, Mitchell's face showed that he realized his mistake. A flicker of recognition that he'd revealed something he should have kept hidden, that he'd said something that couldn't be unsaid. But rather than apologize, rather than back down, he did what people like him always do when caught: he doubled down. He scrambled to recontextualize his words, to pretend they meant something other than what everyone knew they meant. His voice was defensive, aggressive. Troublemakers. Kids who think rules don't apply to them. But nobody was buying it. The damage was done. Mitchell had revealed himself, had shown everyone in that gymnasium exactly who he was and what he believed. And students were already reaching for their phones, recognizing that something historic was happening, something that needed to be documented. Maya stood there, blood dripping from her knee, her cheek still throbbing from Travis's earlier elbow, her whole body aching from being shoved to the ground. And she made a choice. She could walk away, could go to the nurse, could remove herself from this toxic situation. That would be the smart play, the safe play. But something in her refused to back down, refused to let Mitchell's behavior go unchallenged, refused to accept that this was just how things were. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, carrying a dignity that stood in stark contrast to Mitchell's aggression. "Coach, I just want to clean this cut and keep playing." It was a simple request. Reasonable. Respectful. But to Mitchell it felt like defiance. Because Maya wasn't cowering. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't playing the role he'd assigned to her in his mind. She was standing there, bleeding but unbowed, speaking to him like an equal, maintaining her composure when he expected her to break. And that composure, that dignity, threatened everything about his worldview. His voice rose to a shout. "You'll play when I say you can play." He started walking toward her, crossing the gymnasium floor with purposeful strides, his face contorted with rage. And something shifted in the air. Students recognized that this had gone beyond a coaching disagreement, beyond even racial bias. This had become dangerous. Coach Mitchell was out of control and Maya was his target. Phones started coming out of pockets. Students positioned themselves to record, some obviously, others discreetly. They'd been told that recording teachers was against school policy, that they could be suspended for it. But they also knew they were witnessing something that needed to be documented, needed to be captured on video, because without evidence, nothing would happen. Mitchell would tell his version, and administration would believe him like they always did. Maya saw Mitchell approaching and held her ground. She wasn't being aggressive, her hands were at her sides, her posture non-threatening. But she also wasn't backing up, wasn't lowering her eyes, wasn't submitting. She stood there, this 16-year-old girl facing down a 6'2" adult man who was radiating barely controlled violence, and she held her ground with a quiet strength that was almost painful to witness. Mitchell got right in her face, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. His voice was low now, menacing, meant only for her, but loud enough that nearby students caught every word. "You got a problem with authority?" Maya met his eyes steadily. Her voice didn't shake, didn't rise in volume, didn't betray the fear she must have felt. "I have a problem with being treated unfairly." It was the truth, spoken clearly and calmly. But to Mitchell, it was the ultimate insubordination. This student, this black girl who'd been in his class for less than an hour, was calling him unfair. Was challenging his judgment. Was refusing to acknowledge his authority. And he'd had enough. His voice exploded across the gymnasium. "Unfairly? I'll show you unfair. Give me your phone." The accusation made no sense. He'd already seen that students were recording, so why would he think Maya had a phone on her when she was in athletic clothes with no pockets visible? But Mitchell wasn't thinking rationally anymore. He'd convinced himself that Maya must be recording him, must be planning to get him in trouble, must be orchestrating some kind of setup. His paranoia had taken over, fueled by his rage and his prejudice. Maya's response was patient, still trying to de-escalate. "My phone is in my locker, coach. I followed the rules." But Mitchell was beyond hearing her. He didn't believe her, couldn't believe her, because to believe her would be to acknowledge that he was wrong, that he was the one out of control. He took another step closer, invading her space even more aggressively. "Empty your pockets." Maya looked down at herself, at her athletic shorts and t-shirt that clearly had no pockets. She spread her arms slightly, showing him there was nowhere for a phone to be. "Coach Mitchell, I don't have anything." She didn't get to finish the sentence. Mitchell's hand shot out, grabbing for her arm roughly, his fingers closing around her bicep with enough force to leave bruises. He was going to search her himself, was going to physically prove she had a phone, was going to justify his paranoia through force. But Maya's instincts took over. When someone grabs you aggressively, violently, your body reacts before your mind can process. She pulled her arm back, yanking it out of his grip, stepping backward to create distance. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't aggression. It was pure self-defense, the natural reaction of anyone being grabbed by someone who's out of control. But to Mitchell, that instinctive pull away was the final straw. His face went purple with rage and he lunged forward, closing the distance Maya had created. His voice was a roar that echoed off the gymnasium walls. "Don't you dare pull away from me!" Students were shouting now. Some were yelling for him to stop. Others were screaming for someone to get help. Several had their phones up high, making sure every angle was captured. Because they all knew with a certainty that made their blood run cold, that Coach Derek Mitchell was about to do something he couldn't take back. And Maya stood there, her heart pounding, her knees still bleeding, facing down this man who had all the institutional power, all the authority, all the physical advantage. But what she had was something he couldn't take from her. Dignity, courage, and the absolute certainty that what was happening to her was wrong. What would you do in this moment? Would you run? Would you fight back? Would you hold your ground like Maya? Drop your answer in the comments because what happens in the next second changes everything. Coach Mitchell's hand was rising, pulling back, his face twisted with a rage that had nothing to do with coaching or discipline and everything to do with a man whose authority had been challenged by someone he believed had no right to challenge it. The hand was coming forward now, aimed at Maya's face. And she saw it coming. She had time to duck, time to raise her arms, time to protect herself. But she didn't. She stood there, eyes open, witnessing, refusing to cower. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand in your truth and let the world see exactly who's really in the wrong. The slap echoed through the gymnasium like a gunshot. Coach Mitchell's hand connected with Maya's face with enough force to snap her head to the side. The sound was sharp, violent, unmistakable, skin striking skin with the full weight of a grown man's rage behind it. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The basketball that had been bouncing in the corner rolled to a halt. Birds that had been chirping outside the high windows went silent. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to flicker as if the universe itself had paused to witness what had just happened. Then the gasps came. Students sucked in air, their hands flying to their mouths. Someone screamed. Another student dropped their water bottle, and it clattered to the floor, the sound abnormally loud in the shocked silence. But most students just stood frozen, their eyes wide, their minds struggling to process what they just witnessed. A teacher had struck a student. An adult man had slapped a 16-year-old girl across the face. This wasn't discipline. This wasn't correction. This was assault. Maya staggered backward from the impact, her hand flying to her cheek. The skin was already reddening, already showing the clear outline of Mitchell's palm and fingers. Her eyes watered involuntarily, a physical response to the shock and pain, but she blinked rapidly, refusing to let the tears fall. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't give him that. Her cheek burned, throbbed with a heat that radiated down her jaw and up to her temple. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth where her teeth had cut the inside of her cheek. For 3 full seconds there was complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The world had narrowed to this single moment, this line that had been crossed, this act that couldn't be undone. Students held their phones steady, capturing every second, knowing that what they were witnessing would change everything. The red recording lights blinked steadily, documenting evidence that would soon spread far beyond the walls of this gymnasium. Maya slowly lowered her hand from her face. Her cheek was crimson now, the handprint clearly visible, a mark that would bruise by tomorrow. She looked at Coach Mitchell with an expression that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. It was disappointment. Sadness. A weary recognition that she'd been right about him all along. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaking, not with fear but with barely controlled emotion. With the effort of maintaining composure when every instinct screamed to break down or lash out. "You just hit me." 4 words. Simple. Factual. Undeniable. And they landed like an indictment, like a truth that couldn't be argued away or recontextualized. Mitchell seemed to hear them as if from a distance, as if he were waking up from a fugue state. His face, which had been twisted with rage just seconds before, suddenly showed recognition. Or the realization of what he'd just done crashing over him like a wave. His eyes darted around the gymnasium, taking in the 30 students staring at him with shock and revulsion. The phones pointed in his direction, recording. The blood on Maya's knee and now the handprint on her face. The evidence of his loss of control was everywhere, witnessed by everyone, captured on multiple devices. There was no way to take it back. No way to undo it. His career, his reputation, maybe his freedom, All of it had just been destroyed in a single moment of unchecked rage. But Mitchell was a man who'd spent 18 years never being held accountable, never facing real consequences for his actions. And people like that don't suddenly develop self-awareness in moments of crisis. They deflect. They justify. They blame the victim. His voice came out defensive, almost pleading, trying to rewrite what everyone had just witnessed. You were being insubordinate. You pulled away from a teacher. He was talking to the students now, not to Maya, trying to give them a narrative they could accept. A story where he was the wrong party, where his violence was somehow justified. But the students weren't buying it. They'd seen everything. They knew the sequence of events. They knew that Maya had done nothing to deserve what had just happened. Maya's voice cut through his justifications, calm and clear despite everything. You had no right to touch me at all. It was the truth, spoken with a clarity that made Mitchell's excuses sound hollow and desperate. He had no right. Not to grab her arm. Not to invade her space. And certainly not to strike her. Nothing Maya had done, not her excellence, not her composure, not her quiet insistence on being treated fairly, nothing justified what he'd just done. And then chaos erupted. Students rushed forward, surrounding Maya, their voices overlapping in concern and outrage. Jasmine reached her first, her hands hovering around Maya's face, afraid to touch the rapidly swelling cheek. Oh my God, Maya. Oh my God. Are you okay? Other students pressed in, asking the same question, offering water, offering support, their young faces showing a mixture of horror at what they'd witnessed and admiration for how Maya had handled herself. Some students were crying. Others were shouting at Coach Mitchell, their voices high with emotion. How could you do that? She didn't do anything. You're going to jail. Mitchell stood there, suddenly isolated in the middle of his own gymnasium, students giving him a wide berth as if his violence might be contagious. He looked lost, confused, like a man who just watched his entire life implode and couldn't quite figure out how it had happened. The gymnasium doors burst open, and Vice Principal Karen Webster rushed in, her heels clicking rapidly on the polished floor. She'd been in her office when she heard the commotion, the screaming, the shouting, the general uproar that could only mean something had gone very wrong. Her eyes scanned the scene quickly, taking in the crowd of students around Maya, the phones out and recording, Coach Mitchell standing alone looking shell-shocked. Her face remained carefully neutral, but her mind was already working, already calculating how to manage this situation. Webster's voice cut through the chaos with practiced authority. Everyone calm down. What's going on here? But before any student could answer, Mitchell jumped in with his version of events. His voice was rushed, desperate to establish his narrative first. She was defiant, refused to hand over her phone, physically resisted. It was a lie. Not even a clever one. Just a panicked attempt to reframe assault as justified discipline. But Webster was already nodding along, already accepting his story without question, without asking for other perspectives, without even looking at Maya's face where the evidence of what had really happened was clearly visible. Maya's voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the noise around her, but it carried weight. I'd like to call my mother now. It was a request, not a question. The kind of statement that indicated Maya understood her rights, understood that this had gone beyond school discipline into something far more serious. Webster's eyes finally landed on Maya, taking in the handprint on her face, the blood dried on her knee, the way she was holding herself with rigid control. For just a moment, Webster's professional mask slipped, and something like concern flickered across her face. But then it was gone, replaced by her default mode. Protect the institution, minimize the damage, maintain control. Everyone calm down. Maya, come with me. Coach Mitchell will discuss this. The words were carefully chosen. Not Coach Mitchell, come with me too. Not Coach Mitchell, you're suspended immediately. Just a vague promise to discuss this, as if a discussion was an appropriate response to an adult striking a child. Webster was already protecting Mitchell, already downplaying what had happened, already treating this as a discipline issue rather than the assault it was. But the students weren't having it. They erupted in protest, their voices angry and indignant. You hit her. We all saw it. You can't just ignore this. We got it on video. Multiple videos. This is going everywhere. Webster's expression hardened. She turned to face the students, and her voice took on a threatening tone that made her priorities crystal clear. Phones away. Now. Anyone who doesn't delete that footage will be suspended for violating school policy. It was an intimidation tactic, pure and simple. Webster was more concerned with suppressing evidence than with addressing what had actually happened. She was threatening students who documented a crime with suspension, prioritizing the school's reputation and Mitchell's career over justice and accountability. Some students looked nervous, glancing at each other, weighing their options. A few lowered their phones, their fingers hovering over the delete button. But others didn't. They kept recording, more discreetly now, phones held at waist level or partially hidden. They'd already sent copies to friends, already uploaded them to cloud storage, already shared them in group chats. Webster could threaten all she wanted, but the evidence was already out there, already spreading beyond her control. And they knew that deleting the videos meant letting Mitchell get away with what he'd done, meant abandoning Maya, meant being complicit in a cover-up. Maya stood up slowly, accepting Jasmine's steadying hand. Her knee protested, the scraped skin pulling painfully. Her face throbbed with each heartbeat. But she walked toward Vice Principal Webster with her head high, her posture straight, refusing to be diminished by what had happened. As she passed Coach Mitchell, she didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge his existence. He'd become irrelevant to her now, a problem that would be dealt with by people with actual authority. The walk to the principal's office felt endless. Students lined the hallways, having heard the commotion, seeing Maya being escorted by Vice Principal Webster. Whispers followed them. "Is that blood? What happened? Did you see her face? Someone hit her?" Word was already spreading, the story moving through the school like wildfire, growing and morphing with each retelling. Maya's blood dripped steadily from her knee, leaving a trail of small red drops on the polished linoleum floor. The handprint on her face had darkened to an angry red-purple, the outline of each finger clearly visible. She looked like what she was, a victim of violence. But she carried herself like something else entirely, a survivor, a witness, someone who would not be silenced or dismissed. They reached the administrative office, and Webster ushered Maya into the principal's office while barking orders at the secretary to find Principal Henderson immediately. The office was generic and sterile, with motivational posters on the walls about perseverance and success. There was a bookshelf filled with education textbooks that looked like they'd never been opened. A desk with neat stacks of papers. A computer displaying a screensaver of the school logo. Everything about the space screamed bureaucracy and mediocrity. Maya sat in one of the chairs facing the desk, and for the first time since the slap, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Her hands were shaking. Her adrenaline was starting to fade, leaving behind the pain and the emotional trauma. She pulled out her phone, the same phone Mitchell had accused her of having during class, and with trembling fingers she began texting her mother. The message was simple: "Mom, I need you at school now. A teacher hit me." She included photos, her swelling face, her bleeding knee, a wide shot showing she was in the principal's office. Evidence. Documentation. The kind of thing her mother had taught her to always gather because people in power would always try to rewrite the narrative, and you needed proof to counter their lies. Principal Tom Henderson arrived looking like he'd been pulled from something more important. He was a man in his early 60s, balding and slightly overweight, with the weary expression of someone who was just trying to make it to retirement without any major incidents. He looked at Maya, at her face, and something like genuine concern crossed his features. But it was quickly replaced by that familiar administrative worry: how bad is this going to be for us? Vice Principal Webster was already spinning the narrative before Henderson had even fully entered the room. Her voice was carefully measured, framing everything in the most favorable light possible for Mitchell. "Sounds like a discipline issue that escalated. Coach Mitchell was enforcing classroom rules and there was some physical contact. We need to sort out exactly what happened." Physical contact. That's what she called it. Not assault. Not violence. Physical contact. As if Mitchell had accidentally bumped into Maya in the hallway rather than deliberately striking her across the face with enough force to leave a handprint that would last for days. Henderson sat behind his desk, looking uncomfortable, and turned to Maya. His voice was gentler than Webster's, showing at least some humanity. "What happened in your own words, Maya?" And Maya told him. She recounted the entire class period factually, without embellishment, without exaggeration. She described the basketball game, Travis's elbow to her head, Mitchell's comment about her kind, the accusation that she'd flopped when she was clearly injured, the demand for her phone that she didn't have, Mitchell grabbing her arm, her instinctive pull away, and finally the slap. She spoke calmly, chronologically, providing a clear narrative that was devastating in its simplicity. When she finished, Henderson sat back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He looked like a man with a massive headache, which was probably accurate. This was exactly the kind of incident that would bring media attention, district scrutiny, potential lawsuits. His peaceful cruise to retirement had just hit an iceberg. But even in his discomfort, his first instinct was to minimize, to find a way to make this less than it was. His voice was careful, almost apologetic. Coach Mitchell has been here a long time. He's a bit old school in his methods, but he's never... maybe there's been a misunderstanding here. Maya's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. A misunderstanding? He slapped me in front of 30 witnesses. She gestured to her face, to the physical evidence that made Henderson's attempt at downplaying seem absurd. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a difference of interpretation. This was a man losing control and committing violence against a student, captured on multiple videos with dozens of eyewitnesses. But Vice Principal Webster jumped in, her voice taking on an accusatory tone. You did refuse to comply with his instructions, though. You pulled away when he tried to take your phone. Maya's composure cracked slightly, frustration bleeding into her voice. I complied with everything. I just wouldn't accept being treated differently than other students. I did every drill he asked. I did 50 push-ups for a rule violation I didn't commit. I stayed calm when another student elbowed me in the head. I was bleeding and still wanted to keep playing. I was treated differently from white students for doing the exact same things they did. And when I pointed that out, when I maintained my dignity, he hit me. The words hung in the air, a clear and damning summary of systemic bias culminating in violence. Henderson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He seemed sympathetic, seemed to recognize on some level that what Maya was describing was true. But sympathy without action is worthless, and Henderson was a man who'd built his career on avoiding action, on maintaining the status quo. He leaned forward, his voice taking on a cajoling tone, like he was trying to negotiate a truce between equals rather than addressing an adult's assault on a child. Look, Maya, you're new here. You don't know the history, the context. Coach Mitchell's methods are traditional. He comes from a different era of coaching. Maybe if you apologized for the confusion, for the miscommunication, we could all move forward from this. No formal discipline for anyone. Just a learning experience. Hit that subscribe button right now if you can't believe what you're hearing, because this gets even more shocking. Maya stared at Principal Henderson like he'd just spoken in a foreign language. Her voice came out incredulous, almost laughing at the absurdity of what he was suggesting. Apologize. The word hung there, heavy with disbelief. He wanted her to apologize. The victim. The 16-year-old girl with a handprint on her face and blood on her leg. He wanted her to apologize to the man who'd assaulted her, to make it easier for everyone, to smooth things over so the school wouldn't have to deal with the consequences of their teacher's actions. Webster nodded, as if Henderson had suggested something perfectly reasonable. It would smooth things over. We can call this a mutual misunderstanding, no discipline for anyone. You get a clean slate at your new school, Coach Mitchell continues his career, and we all learn from this experience. A mutual misunderstanding. They were trying to frame assault as a two-sided conflict, as if Maya bore equal responsibility for being struck. They were offering her a deal. Stay quiet, take partial blame, and we'll all pretend this didn't happen. It was a deal they'd probably made many times before with other students, other victims, other incidents that got buried in the name of protecting the institution. But they didn't understand who they were dealing with. They saw a 16-year-old girl, a new student with no power, no connections, someone who could be managed and manipulated into compliance. They had no idea. Maya's voice was quiet but firm, cutting through their attempts at negotiation. My mother is on her way. It was a simple statement, but it made Henderson and Webster exchange glances. Nervous glances. They'd dealt with angry parents before, but something in Maya's tone suggested this might be different. Still, they were school administrators. They'd weathered parental storms before. They had their scripts, their deflections, their ways of managing concerned mothers and fathers. One more parent wasn't going to change their approach. Henderson tried to sound reassuring, patronizing. That's fine. We're happy to discuss this with your parents. We'll all sit down together and work this out like adults. Webster was already mentally preparing her presentation, the way she'd frame the incident to make it sound less serious, the way she'd emphasize Maya's role in the escalation, the way she'd paint Mitchell as a dedicated teacher who'd made a momentary error in judgment. She'd done this dance before and she was good at it. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know because Maya had honored her mother's request for anonymity, was that the parent about to walk through their door wasn't just any concerned mother. She wasn't someone who could be patronized or dismissed or negotiated with. She was Dr. Patricia Thompson, the new superintendent of the entire district. Their boss's boss's boss. The person who held their careers in her hands. And in about 10 minutes she was going to walk into that office, see her daughter's face, and everything was going to change. Maya sat there quietly, one hand resting on her injured knee, the other checking her phone for her mother's response. The text had been read immediately and the response came back just as fast. On my way. Don't say anything else. I love you. Henderson was rambling now, trying to fill the silence, talking about school policies and discipline procedures and his years of experience in education. Webster was nodding along, occasionally adding her own commentary about the importance of respecting teachers and understanding that sometimes physical education involved physical contact. They were building their narrative, rehearsing their defense, confident that they could control this situation like they'd controlled so many others. But Maya wasn't listening anymore. She was thinking about the videos that were already spreading through social media. About the 30 witnesses who'd seen what really happened. About the pattern of complaints against Mitchell that Jasmine had mentioned, that had been buried and ignored. About the systemic failures that had allowed a man like Mitchell to terrorize students for 18 years without meaningful consequences. And she was thinking about her mother, about the look that would be on Dr. Patricia Thompson's face when she walked into this office and saw what had been done to her daughter. Henderson and Webster thought they were dealing with a discipline problem. They thought they were managing a minor incident that would blow over. They had no idea they were about to face a reckoning. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second bringing them closer to the moment when their carefully constructed narrative would collapse. Closer to the moment when their attempts at cover-up would be exposed. Closer to the moment when justice would finally arrive. And Maya sat there, her face throbbing, her knee bleeding, her dignity intact, and she waited. Because she knew something Henderson and Webster didn't. She knew that sometimes the people who seem powerless hold all the power they need. Sometimes truth is enough. Sometimes courage is enough. Sometimes being willing to stand in your dignity and refuse to be diminished is enough. Do you think Maya should have accepted their deal for the sake of moving on, or did she make the right choice to wait for her mother? Let us know in the comments what you would have done. The door to the administrative office opened and closed as the secretary went about her business, making phone calls, filing papers, completely unaware that the next person to walk through that door would change everything. Henderson droned on about conflict resolution and the importance of moving forward. Webster checked her watch, clearly wanting this handled quickly so she could get back to her other duties. And Maya waited. Patient. Resolute. Unbroken. Because she knew that justice was on its way, walking through the school parking lot right now in heels and a navy suit, with fire in her eyes and the power to burn down everything that had protected men like Coach Mitchell for far too long. The storm was coming. And they had no idea. The main office door opened and every head turned. A professional black woman in an elegant navy suit stepped through, her presence commanding immediate attention. She wore her authority like a second skin, not in an aggressive way, but with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned every ounce of respect she commanded. Her hair was pulled back in an immaculate bun, diamond studs glinted at her ears, and her designer glasses framed intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She carried a leather briefcase in one hand, and her heels clicked with purpose on the tile floor. The secretary looked up from her desk, offering the practiced smile she gave to all parents. Can I help you? The woman's voice was measured, professional, with an undertone of steel that suggested this was not someone to be trifled with. I'm here for my daughter, Maya Thompson. The secretary's fingers moved to her phone, pressing the intercom button that connected to the principal's office. Her voice was casual, routine, completely unaware of the bomb she was about to drop. Maya's mother is here. In the principal's office, Henderson and Webster exchanged glances. Good. They could deal with this together, present a united front, use their experience to manage this concerned parent. Henderson straightened his tie. Webster smoothed her skirt. They stood, preparing to greet Maya's mother with their well-rehearsed script about unfortunate misunderstandings and moving forward constructively. The secretary appeared at the door, gesturing for Patricia to follow her back to the principal's office. As they walked down the short hallway, Patricia's eyes took in everything: the faded motivational posters, the scuffed floors, the general air of an institution that had stopped trying to be excellent and settled for merely functional. This was one of her schools now, and she was already mentally cataloging everything that needed to change. The secretary knocked and opened the door to Henderson's office, and Patricia stepped through. Her eyes immediately found Maya, sitting in the chair with her injured knee and her swollen face, and for just a fraction of a second, her professional mask cracked. A mother's anguish flashed across her features, raw, painful, furious. But then she locked it down, her expression hardening into something cold and controlled. Because she couldn't just be Maya's mother right now. She had to be the superintendent. She had to be the person who would ensure this never happened to any child again. Henderson stepped forward with his hand extended, his voice warm and conciliatory, already beginning his prepared speech. "Miss Thompson, thank you for coming in so quickly. There was an incident in PE class today and we wanted to—" Patricia's voice cut through his words like a scalpel, cold and precise. "It's Dr. Thompson. And I'm aware there was an incident. My daughter sent me photos." She emphasized the word, incident, with just enough sarcasm to make it clear she knew they were downplaying what had happened. Henderson's smile faltered slightly, but he pressed on, launching into his damage control speech. He talked about how seriously they took student safety, about how they were still gathering facts, about how sometimes in the heat of athletic competition, physical contact could be misinterpreted. He used every buzzword and euphemism in the administrative playbook, carefully avoiding words like assault or violence. Patricia stood perfectly still, her briefcase in one hand, her other hand resting calmly at her side. She let Henderson talk, let him dig himself deeper with every word, her expression revealing nothing. Webster chimed in occasionally with her own contributions to the narrative, talking about Coach Mitchell's long tenure and dedication, about the challenges of managing today's students, about the importance of not rushing to judgment. When they finally ran out of steam, when their prepared speeches had been delivered and they stood there waiting for her response, Patricia spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it carried absolute authority. "I'd like to see the coach who struck my daughter." The words were not a request. They were a command. Henderson and Webster exchanged glances, suddenly uncertain. Something about this woman was throwing off their usual script. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't doing any of the things they'd learned to manage and upset parents. She was controlled, precise, and somehow that was far more intimidating. Webster moved to the phone on Henderson's desk, pressing the intercom button that connected to the PE department. Her voice was strained. "Coach Mitchell, please report to the principal's office immediately." The wait felt eternal. Maya sat quietly in her chair, watching her mother with a mixture of relief and anticipation. She'd seen this side of her mother before. The superintendent's side, the leader's side, the side that had broken through glass ceilings and navigated hostile boardrooms. But Henderson and Webster had no idea what was coming. They thought they were dealing with an angry parent. They didn't realize they were standing in front of a reckoning. The office door opened and Coach Mitchell stepped through. He'd changed out of his athletic wear into khakis and a button-down shirt, trying to look more professional, more respectable. But there was sweat on his brow, and his eyes were defensive, already preparing to justify his actions. He'd spent the last 30 minutes convincing himself that he'd done nothing wrong, that he'd been defending his authority, that Maya had brought this on herself. He saw Patricia standing there, a black woman in a business suit, and his expression shifted. There was a flash of something ugly in his eyes, a snap judgment based purely on what he saw. He made assumptions about who she was, what she did, what kind of threat she posed. Which was to say, he didn't see her as a threat at all. Just another parent he could talk down to, another person who didn't understand the realities of teaching, another obstacle to be managed. Mitchell's voice came out patronizing, condescending, every word dripping with the assumption of his own superiority. "Ma'am, your daughter was being disrespectful today. Sometimes students need firm correction, and in my experience, parents who weren't there don't always understand the full context of." Patricia's voice cut him off, cold as ice. "You struck my 16-year-old daughter across the face." She said it simply, factually, letting the words hang in the air like an accusation and a verdict all at once. Mitchell's jaw tightened, his defensive posture becoming more aggressive. He'd clearly decided to double down, to paint himself as the righteous authority figure who'd been unfairly attacked. "I disciplined a student who was defiant, who refused to follow instructions, who physically resisted when I tried to enforce classroom rules. It was a controlled action in response to." Patricia took one step forward, and somehow that single step made Mitchell's words die in his throat. Her voice was quiet, deadly. "There is no universe where you're authorized to put your hands on any child in violence." The word, violence, hung between them. Mitchell tried to regain his footing, tried to reframe what he'd done as something other than what it was. His tone became even more condescending, the tone of a man explaining reality to someone he believed too ignorant to understand. "With all due respect, ma'am, I've been teaching for 18 years. Sometimes parents don't understand what we deal with in the classroom, the challenges of managing difficult students, the split-second decisions we have to make. Your daughter was disrupting my class, showing off, and when I tried to address it, she—" Patricia's voice remained controlled, but there was something dangerous in it now. 18 years. At this school specifically? Mitchell seemed confused by the question, thrown off his script. "Yes, ma'am." 18 years at Westridge High. I think I know how to handle. And in those 18 years, how many complaints have been filed against you? The question landed like a bomb. Mitchell's face went red, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Because there had been complaints. Lots of them. Parents calling about his harsh treatment of their children. Students reporting his discriminatory behavior. Teachers whispering concerns to administrators. But nothing had ever come of them. They'd been filed away, dismissed, buried under the weight of Mitchell's tenure and the administration's desire to avoid conflict. Henderson jumped in, trying to regain control of the conversation, his voice nervous. Dr. Thompson, perhaps we should all sit down and discuss this calmly? Patricia turned to him, and Henderson actually took a step backward from the look in her eyes. Tom, I think we're past discussion. And that's when it happened. Henderson's face went pale, the blood draining so quickly he looked like he might faint. His eyes went wide, his mouth falling open in horror. Dr. Thompson? The name finally clicked into place. Not Miss Thompson, some random parent. Dr. Thompson. Dr. Patricia Thompson. The new superintendent who'd been hired 2 weeks ago, whose arrival had been announced in district-wide emails, whose photo had been in the local newspaper. The woman who was now his boss, who controlled his job, who had the power to end his career with a single decision. Vice Principal Webster's confident posture crumbled like a sandcastle hit by a wave. Her face went from self-assured to terrified in the span of a heartbeat. She'd been threatening students with suspension for recording evidence. She'd been protecting Mitchell. She'd been trying to cover up an assault. And she'd done it all in front of the superintendent. Mitchell was still clueless, looking between the three of them with confusion. What's going on? Why is everyone? Patricia turned her full attention to him, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. I'm Dr. Patricia Thompson. I started as superintendent of this district 2 weeks ago. The words hit Mitchell like a physical blow. His face drained of color, going from red to white in an instant. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hands, which had been gesturing as he spoke, fell limply to his sides. The realization of what he'd done, not just striking a student but striking the superintendent's daughter, crashed over him like a tsunami. But Patricia wasn't done. Her voice continued, relentless, damning. I transferred my daughter here to evaluate our schools from a parent's perspective. I wanted to see how students, particularly students of color, are really treated when no one's watching. When they don't know who's connected to power. When they think there won't be consequences. The words hung in the air, and the full scope of what had happened began to sink in. This hadn't been a random incident. Maya's presence at Westridge had been a test, an evaluation, and the school had failed spectacularly. Mitchell had revealed exactly who he was, and he'd done it in the worst possible circumstances. Henderson started stammering, his words tripping over each other in his panic. Dr. Thompson, we didn't, if I had known, this is all a terrible misunderstanding, we would never. Patricia held up her hand, and Henderson's babbling stopped immediately. Her voice was cold, final. I've seen enough. Coach Mitchell, you're suspended effective immediately pending a full investigation. You are to leave school property now and have no contact with students or staff until the investigation is complete. Mitchell's brain finally rebooted, and with it came desperate anger. His voice rose, shaking with fury and fear. You can't do this. I have tenure. The union will fight this. You can't just suspend me without due process. Patricia's expression didn't change. The union will have access to 32 witness statements and 7 videos of you assaulting a minor. I suggest you contact them. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see justice served, because this story is about to get even better. 32 witness statements. 7 videos. Patricia had done her homework. In the time it had taken her to drive from her office to the school, she'd already been working. Already collecting evidence. Already building an airtight case. Because this wasn't just about Maya anymore. This was about every student Mitchell had terrorized over 18 years. This was about every complaint that had been buried. This was about systemic change. Mitchell's face cycled through emotions, rage, fear, denial, desperation. His voice became pleading, all his condescension evaporating. Dr. Thompson, please. I've dedicated my life to this school. I made a mistake, yes, but I can't lose my career over one moment of... One moment? Patricia's voice was sharp. One moment that was witnessed by 30 students who are currently sharing their own stories about your behavior. One moment that caps off 18 years of complaints that were ignored. One moment that reveals a pattern of discrimination and abuse that this district has enabled. So no, Coach Mitchell, this isn't about one moment. This is about who you've been showing us you are for nearly 2 decades. She turned to Henderson, and the principal looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Tom, I'll need all of Coach Mitchell's personnel files, all complaints filed against him, and all documentation of how those complaints were handled. I'll also need Vice Principal Webster's files on the same subjects. On my desk by tomorrow morning. Webster made a small sound, almost a whimper. She'd been implicated too. Her efforts to protect Mitchell, to threaten students, to cover up the incident, all of it had been witnessed by the superintendent. Her career was likely over too. Patricia continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone issuing non-negotiable commands. I'm calling an emergency school board meeting for tomorrow evening. I expect full cooperation from all staff members. Any student who witnessed today's incident or has experienced similar treatment will have the opportunity to provide testimony without fear of retaliation. Any staff member who attempts to intimidate witnesses will face immediate termination. She paused, looking at each of them in turn, Henderson, Webster, Mitchell. Her next words were delivered with devastating calm. And be aware that I've already contacted the district attorney's office. This matter will be investigated criminally as well as administratively. Coach Mitchell, the assault of a minor is a serious crime, and there's more than enough evidence to pursue charges. Mitchell's legs seemed to give out. He collapsed into a chair, his face in his hands. The full weight of what he'd done, what he was facing, had finally hit him. Criminal charges. Loss of his teaching license. Possible jail time. His entire life, his entire identity, destroyed in a single moment of unchecked rage. Webster was crying quietly, mascara running down her face. Henderson looked 10 years older than he had 15 minutes ago, his hopes of a peaceful retirement shattered. They'd all known Mitchell was a problem. They'd all had opportunities to address it. And they'd all chosen to look the other way to protect the institution, to avoid conflict. Now they would pay the price for that cowardice. Patricia walked over to Maya, her professional mask finally cracking as she knelt beside her daughter's chair. Her hand gently touched Maya's swollen cheek, her eyes filling with tears she wouldn't let fall. Not yet. Not here. When she spoke, her voice was soft, meant only for Maya. I'm so proud of you, baby. For your courage. For your dignity. For standing up even when it was hard. You did everything right. Maya's own tears finally fell, the composure she'd maintained all day finally breaking in the safety of her mother's presence. Mom, I just wanted to be normal. I just wanted to see what it was really like. I didn't mean for this to... Patricia shook her head. You have nothing to apologize for. Nothing. You were exactly who you should be. The problem was never you. And now we're going to make sure this never happens to another student again. She stood, returning to superintendent mode, her voice once again carrying authority. Tom, I need you to arrange for the school nurse to document Maya's injuries officially. Photographs, written report, the full medical documentation. And I'll need the contact information for all students who were in that PE class. Henderson nodded mutely, looking like he might be sick. Patricia gathered her briefcase and put her hand on Maya's shoulder. We're leaving now. Maya will not be returning to this school. I'll be enrolling her at Riverside High starting tomorrow. And Tom, Henderson looked up, terrified. I'll see you at the district office at 8 a.m. sharp tomorrow. Bring everything I asked for. As Patricia and Maya walked toward the door, Mitchell's voice called out from where he sat slumped in the chair, desperate and broken. Dr. Thompson, please. I have a family. I have a mortgage. I can't lose everything over. Patricia stopped, turned back to face him. Her voice was not cruel, but it was merciless. You should have thought about your family before you put your hands on someone else's child. You should have thought about your career before you created a hostile environment for students of color. You should have thought about the consequences before you spent 18 years abusing your authority. This isn't happening to you, Coach Mitchell. This is happening because of you. She turned back to the door, her arm around Maya's shoulders. As they walked through the main office, past the secretary who was desperately trying to look busy, past the motivational posters that rang hollow after what had just transpired, Patricia made a silent vow. This was just the beginning. Coach Mitchell's suspension was just the first domino. The entire system that had protected him, that had enabled him, that had looked the other way while he terrorized students, that system was about to face a reckoning. What do you think should happen to Principal Henderson and Vice Principal Webster for their role in trying to cover this up? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Outside, as they walked toward Patricia's car, Maya finally spoke. Mom, I'm sorry I asked you to keep it secret. If you'd told them who you were from the beginning... Patricia stopped, turning to face her daughter, her hands on Maya's shoulders. No. You were right to want to see the truth. Because now I know. Now I've seen firsthand how students are treated when they think there's no accountability. You gave me something I could never have gotten from reports and statistics. You gave me the truth. And that truth is going to change this entire district. They got in the car, and as Patricia started the engine, she looked at her daughter's bruised face one more time. The anger that flashed in her eyes was righteous and terrible. Coach Derek Mitchell had made the biggest mistake of his life today. But more than that, he'd exposed a system that allowed people like him to thrive. And Dr. Patricia Thompson was about to dismantle that system, brick by brick, policy by policy, until no child would ever have to endure what Maya had endured. The car pulled away from Westridge High School, leaving behind a principal's office in chaos, a coach facing criminal charges, and an entire administration that had just learned that accountability, delayed for so long, had finally arrived. Tomorrow would bring the school board meeting, the investigations, the media attention. But tonight, Patricia Thompson had only one priority: taking care of her daughter. Justice had been a long time coming to Westridge High. But it had finally arrived. And it wasn't going anywhere. The moment Patricia Thompson's car left the Westridge High parking lot, the floodgates opened. Students who'd witnessed the slap, who'd been threatened with suspension for recording it, who'd been told to stay quiet and move on, they'd been holding their breath, waiting to see if there would be consequences or if this would be just another incident swept under the rug like so many before it. But when word spread that Maya's mother was the new superintendent, that Coach Mitchell had been suspended, that there would actually be accountability this time, everything changed. Within 15 minutes, the videos were everywhere. Not just on one platform but across every social media site students used. TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat. The footage of Coach Mitchell slapping Maya went viral with a speed that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The caption on most posts was simple: "This is what happens at Westridge High when teachers think no one important is watching." The hashtag Justice for Maya started trending locally, then regionally, then nationally. But it wasn't just about the video. Students who'd been silent for years, who'd endured Mitchell's abuse and believed nothing could be done about it, suddenly found their voices. The testimonials started pouring in: written statements, video recordings, audio messages. Current students, yes, but also former students who'd graduated years ago, who'd carried the trauma of Mitchell's treatment with them into adulthood, who'd never thought anyone would listen or care. A Latina student who'd graduated 3 years prior recorded a tearful video describing how Mitchell used to mock her accent in front of the entire class, how he'd make her run extra laps if she spoke Spanish to her friends, how he'd told her she'd never amount to anything because your people don't value education. She was in college now, pre-med, proving him wrong with every grade she earned. But the wounds were still there, still raw. A black student from the class of 2022 wrote a detailed statement about how Mitchell had accused him of stealing equipment from the gym, had searched his bag in front of everyone, had found nothing but still made him run punishment drills for being suspicious. The boy had quit basketball after that, a sport he'd loved since childhood, because he couldn't bear being in that gymnasium anymore. An Asian American student described how Mitchell constantly asked if she was really trying, or just naturally bad at sports because of her background, how he'd make assumptions about her athletic ability based purely on her ethnicity, how he'd express surprise whenever she succeeded as if it were an anomaly rather than earned achievement. The stories went on and on. Dozens of them. Hundreds of them. Each one a small tragedy, a moment where a young person had been diminished, humiliated, traumatized by someone who was supposed to be educating and protecting them. Together they painted a picture of a pattern so clear, so undeniable, that no amount of institutional protection could hide it anymore. Patricia Thompson spent that entire evening in her home office, reading every testimonial, watching every video, compiling evidence with the precision of someone building an airtight case. Because she knew how these things went. She knew that Mitchell would have a union lawyer, would have defenders who'd argue about due process and innocent until proven guilty. She needed documentation so overwhelming that there could be no question, no ambiguity, no room for the system to protect him one more time. At 9 p.m. that night, she made a phone call to the school board president. Her voice was calm but left no room for negotiation. "We need an emergency meeting tomorrow evening. Full board, open to the public, media invited. This cannot wait for the regular schedule." The board president started to object, started to talk about procedures and proper notice, but Patricia cut him off. "A teacher assaulted a student on camera. Multiple students are coming forward with evidence of years of abuse. If we don't address this immediately, publicly, and decisively, we're complicit. The meeting is tomorrow at 7 p.m. I'll see you there." She hung up before he could argue further. Then she made her next call, to the local news stations. Because transparency wasn't just a buzzword for Patricia Thompson. It was a weapon against institutional corruption. If this was going to be handled properly, it needed to happen in the light, where everyone could see, where there could be no backroom deals or quiet retirements with full pensions. By 10 p.m., the local news had picked up the story. The evening broadcast led with it, Superintendent's daughter assaulted by teacher at Westridge High. They had the video heavily pixelated to protect Maya's identity but still showing clearly what had happened. They had statements from students. They had Patricia on the phone, professional and composed, stating that the district took student safety seriously and that a full investigation was underway. The story went regional by 11 p.m. and national by midnight. Back at Westridge High, Coach Mitchell sat in his darkened living room, his phone blowing up with calls from his lawyer, the union rep, friends asking what the hell was going on, his wife crying in the bedroom because their lives were imploding in real time. He'd been escorted from school property that afternoon by security, told not to return, told not to contact any students or staff. His keys had been confiscated. His access to school systems had been revoked. In the span of 3 hours, he'd gone from untouchable to radioactive. He kept replaying the moment in his mind, trying to figure out where it had gone wrong, trying to rewrite the narrative in a way that made sense. He'd just been doing his job. Maintaining discipline. That girl had been defiant, had challenged his authority. He'd reacted instinctively to restore order. How was he supposed to know who her mother was? How was any of this fair? But deep down, in a place he wouldn't consciously acknowledge, Mitchell knew the truth. It didn't matter who Maya's mother was. What he'd done was wrong. And Maya wasn't even the first student he'd struck. She was just the first one with enough power behind her to make the consequences stick. All those other students, the ones he'd shoved or grabbed or intimidated over the years, they'd complained and nothing had happened. So he'd learned he was untouchable. The system had taught him that lesson very clearly. Until today, when the system finally failed him the way it had failed all those students. Vice Principal Webster was in similar straits, suspended pending investigation, her laptop and files seized as evidence. She kept thinking about the moment she'd threatened students with suspension for recording, the moment she tried to get them to delete evidence of a crime. What had she been thinking? She knew what she'd been thinking. Protect the school, protect the administration, keep things quiet, avoid scandal. That's what she'd been taught to do over 20 years in education administration. But she'd crossed a line and she knew it. She'd prioritized reputation over truth, and now it was going to cost her everything. Principal Henderson couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, knowing that tomorrow morning he had to face Dr. Thompson with files that would damn him. Files showing all the complaints against Mitchell that had been received and buried. Files showing the pattern of behavior that Henderson had been aware of and chosen to ignore. Files that would prove he'd been complicit in creating an environment where a teacher could terrorize students for nearly 2 decades without meaningful consequences. His retirement, which had been so close he could taste it, was going to be very different than he'd imagined. The next morning, Westridge High was chaos. Students arrived to find news vans in the parking lot, reporters trying to get statements, the building buzzing with an energy that was part outrage, part vindication, part hope that maybe things would actually change this time. Classes were a joke. Teachers tried to conduct lessons, but students were glued to their phones, following the story, sharing their own experiences, organizing. Jasmine Rodriguez stood in the hallway between classes, her phone in her hand, watching the video of Maya being slapped play out on her screen for the 100th time. She was recording her own testimonial now, talking about all the times she'd seen Mitchell target students of color, all the times she'd wanted to speak up but had been too afraid. But not anymore. Maya had been brave enough to stand her ground, and now Jasmine could be brave too. She hit upload and felt something like liberation wash over her. By that evening, the Westridge High auditorium was packed beyond capacity. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and in the aisles. Students, parents, teachers, community members, journalists with cameras and notepads. The school board sat at a long table on the stage, looking uncomfortable under the bright lights and intense scrutiny. This was not how they usually operated. Normally, board meetings were sparsely attended, boring affairs where routine business was conducted with minimal public input. This was different. This mattered. Dr. Patricia Thompson stood at the podium, a thick folder of documentation in front of her, and the room fell silent. She didn't need to raise her voice or demand attention. Her presence commanded it. When she spoke, her words were measured, factual, devastating. She presented findings that painted a comprehensive picture of systemic failure. She had documented 37 formal complaints filed against Coach Mitchell over 18 years, none of which had resulted in meaningful discipline. She had evidence of discriminatory treatment patterns affecting students of color at rates significantly higher than white students. She had testimonials from 64 students, current and former, describing hostile treatment, racial bias, and physical intimidation. She had 7 videos of the assault on Maya, taken from different angles, leaving no room for alternative interpretations. The board members shifted in their seats, their faces growing more troubled with each piece of evidence presented. They'd known Mitchell was controversial. They'd known there had been complaints. But they'd never seen it all laid out like this, the pattern undeniable, the scope staggering. How had this been allowed to continue for so long? Then came the student testimonials. One by one, young people stood at the microphone and told their stories. They spoke with trembling voices about being singled out, being humiliated, being made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. They spoke about loving sports but dreading PE class, about losing confidence, about internalizing the message that they weren't good enough, weren't wanted, weren't valued. A young black student described how Mitchell had told him he should focus on basketball instead of academics because that's where people like you succeed. The student was now on the honor roll, taking AP classes, planning to study engineering. But Mitchell's words had haunted him, had made him doubt himself, had required him to work twice as hard to believe he deserved his achievements. An immigrant student from the Middle East described how Mitchell had made jokes about terrorism, had questioned her loyalty to America, had treated her with suspicion that made her feel like a stranger in her own school. She'd thought about transferring, about giving up, about making herself invisible just to survive. But she'd stayed, and now she was speaking up, and her voice wasn't trembling anymore. The testimonials went on for nearly an hour. The board members listened with increasingly horrified expressions. The journalists scribbled furiously in their notepads. Parents wiped tears from their eyes. And somewhere in the back of the room, Coach Mitchell's lawyer sat with a legal pad covered in notes, knowing with growing certainty that this case was unwinnable. When he stood to speak in Mitchell's defense, his argument felt hollow before he even began. He talked about generational differences in coaching styles, about how what was acceptable in previous eras had changed, about how Mitchell came from a time when discipline was firmer and students were expected to be tougher. He tried to paint Mitchell as a man out of step with modern sensibilities rather than someone who'd committed assault and engaged in years of discriminatory behavior. The room erupted in angry murmurs. Generational differences? That's what he was calling racism and violence? A mother in the audience stood up and shouted that her grandmother had taught in the 1960s and had never struck a student, had never used racial slurs, had never created a hostile environment. This wasn't about generations, it was about character. The lawyer pressed on, arguing that Mitchell deserved consideration for his years of service, that one mistake shouldn't define a career, that termination was too harsh a penalty. But even as he spoke, he could see he was losing. The evidence was too overwhelming. The harm too clear. The public sentiment too unified. And then Maya stood up. She hadn't been planning to speak. She testified earlier in a private session with the board, had shared her story in detail. But watching all these other students be brave, hearing their pain, knowing they'd found the courage to speak because she'd gone first, she felt compelled to add her voice to theirs. She walked to the microphone and the room fell silent again. Here was the girl at the center of it all, the superintendent's daughter, the one who'd been slapped on camera. But as she began to speak, it became clear she wasn't talking about herself. She described what she'd witnessed in a single day at Westridge High. The Latino student Mitchell had berated about speaking proper English. The way Travis had been praised for the same aggressive behavior that had gotten her punished. The different standards, the obvious bias, the hostile environment that had been so normal to everyone there that they'd stopped questioning it. She talked about Jasmine warning her to keep her head down, about students learning to make themselves small just to survive a PE class. And then she said something that cut through all the legal arguments and policy discussions and hit at the heart of the matter. She looked directly at the board and said that what happened to her was terrible, yes, but what was worse was knowing it had been happening to students without powerful parents for years. That she'd only gotten justice because of who her mother was, while countless other students had been ignored. That the system had failed them long before it failed her, and if the board truly cared about student safety, they needed to acknowledge that and commit to real change. If you believe every student deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of who their parents are, hit that subscribe button right now. The auditorium erupted in applause. Students jumped to their feet, whistling and cheering. Parents joined them. Even some teachers, the ones who'd been uncomfortable with Mitchell for years but hadn't known how to challenge him, stood and applauded. Maya stood at that microphone, composed and powerful, and she just shifted the entire conversation from one teacher's misconduct to systemic accountability. The board went into closed session to deliberate. It took them less than 30 minutes to reach a decision. When they returned, the board president read the resolution with a grave expression. Coach Derek Mitchell was terminated immediately for cause, effective today. His teaching license would be reported to the state board for permanent revocation. Vice Principal Karen Webster was given the option to resign in lieu of termination, which her lawyer accepted immediately. And Principal Tom Henderson, citing health concerns and the desire to focus on family, announced his early retirement effective at the end of the month. The vote was unanimous, 7-0. No dissent. No protection. The institutional shield that had protected Mitchell for 18 years had finally, definitively failed. The auditorium erupted again, this time in celebration. Students hugged each other, crying with relief and vindication. Parents who'd complained for years and been dismissed felt a weight lift from their shoulders. This was what accountability looked like. This was what it felt like when the system actually worked the way it was supposed to. But Dr. Patricia Thompson wasn't celebrating yet. Because firing 3 people while necessary wasn't enough. The culture that had enabled them, the policies that had protected them, the system that had allowed harm to continue unchecked, that all needed to change too. And that was going to be her life's work here. Over the next month, Patricia implemented reforms that rippled through the entire district. Mandatory bias training for all staff wasn't optional or cursory, it was comprehensive, uncomfortable, designed to actually challenge assumptions and change behavior. An anonymous reporting system was established where students could report concerns without fear of retaliation, with every report investigated by an independent office that didn't answer to building principals. The district launched a diverse hiring initiative, actively recruiting teachers of color, teachers from different backgrounds, teachers who could provide representation for all students. Student voice was elevated. A discipline policy committee was formed with actual students serving alongside administrators, giving young people input into the rules that governed their lives. At Westridge High specifically, the changes were even more visible. Maya had transferred to Riverside High as planned, but she'd started something that didn't leave with her. Students formed an advocacy group focused on equity and inclusion, meeting weekly to discuss concerns and propose solutions. The group quickly spread to other schools in the district, student-led chapters popping up across every building. The vacant PE position at Westridge was filled by Coach Simone Waters, a 32-year-old black woman who'd competed in track and field at the Olympic trials and had a master's degree in sports psychology. She brought a completely different energy to the program, demanding but respectful, challenging but supportive, treating every student like an athlete worthy of investment regardless of their background or current skill level. Students who'd been dreading PE class suddenly found themselves actually enjoying it. They were learning proper technique, getting constructive feedback, being pushed to improve without being humiliated. The change in culture was palpable. Hallways felt different, more inclusive, safer. Students of color walked with their heads higher. International students spoke their native languages without fear. The whole atmosphere of the school had shifted. 3 months after the incident, Maya returned to Westridge High for a special assembly where Dr. Thompson was presenting the new district equity policies. Maya stood in the hallway afterward, surrounded by students thanking her for her courage, telling her that her standing up had changed their lives, had given them permission to use their own voices. She found herself walking past the gymnasium, drawn by some instinct to see it again. The doors were open and she could hear Coach Waters leading a class inside. Maya stepped in just to observe, and what she saw made her smile. Students were engaged, laughing, working hard but clearly enjoying themselves. A basketball game was in progress, and the energy was competitive but supportive, students cheering for each other regardless of what team they were on. Coach Waters saw her and waved her over, asking if she wanted to join in. Maya hesitated for just a moment, memories of that terrible day flooding back. But then she looked around at the students playing with joy instead of fear and she nodded. She joined the game, and within minutes she was in her element again, the sport she loved no longer tainted by the trauma of what had happened here. After the class ended, as students were heading to the locker rooms, someone approached her hesitantly. It was Travis Henderson, the boy who'd elbowed her that day, who'd been praised by Mitchell for the aggressive play that had hurt her. He looked nervous, his hands shoved in his pockets, his eyes not quite meeting hers. His voice was quiet, almost ashamed. "Maya, I wanted to apologize. For that day, for hurting you. But also for everything else. Coach Mitchell always told us that being aggressive, being dominant, using our size against smaller players, that was what made us tough, what made us real athletes. He taught us that the way to win was to intimidate people, especially if they looked different than us. I didn't even realize how wrong that was until everything happened. You standing up to him, refusing to back down even when he hit you, that showed me what real strength looks like. Thank you for that. You freed all of us from learning to be the wrong kind of person. Maya looked at him for a long moment. She could see genuine remorse in his face, genuine understanding of how he'd been shaped by Mitchell's toxicity. She smiled, not a big smile but a genuine one. We all deserve to be treated with dignity, Travis. Every single one of us. I'm glad you see that now. He nodded, relief washing over his features, and walked away. Maya stood there in the gymnasium that had been the site of so much pain, and she felt something like closure. The space was different now. Reclaimed. Transformed from a place of fear into a place of growth and community. From the high windows of the gymnasium, if you looked up and across the courtyard, you could see into Dr. Patricia Thompson's office. She stood at her window, coffee in hand, watching her daughter in that gym, and pride radiated from every line of her body. Maya had been through something traumatic, something no parent ever wants their child to experience. But she'd faced it with a courage and dignity that had sparked real change. Not just policy changes or personnel changes but cultural change. Heart change. One moment of courage didn't just change one school, it transformed an entire district. Because sometimes the people who seem powerless hold all the power they need. Truth, dignity, and the refusal to accept injustice. Maya had walked into Westridge High as a new student just wanting to be normal, to be treated fairly. And when that fairness was denied, when violence was used to silence her, she didn't shrink. She didn't disappear. She stood her ground, and in doing so, she changed the lives of every student who came after her. Coach Derek Mitchell's teaching license was permanently revoked by the State Board of Education 3 months after the incident. He faced criminal charges for assault of a minor and ultimately accepted a plea deal that included probation, community service, mandatory anger management counseling, and a permanent ban from working with children in any capacity. His name became synonymous with everything wrong with unchecked authority and institutional protection of harmful behavior. Dr. Patricia Thompson's reforms at Westridge weren't just local news, they became a blueprint. Other districts across the state, then across the nation, reached out asking for guidance on implementing similar policies. She published a paper on student-centered accountability that was cited in educational journals and used in administrator training programs. The changes she implemented became a model for how districts could move from reactive crisis management to proactive culture building. And Maya? Maya graduated from Riverside High 3 years later as valedictorian. Her graduation speech focused on the power of speaking truth to power, of standing in your dignity even when everything tells you to back down. She went on to college, studying law and education policy, with plans to continue the work her mother had started. She wanted to make sure that students everywhere had systems in place to protect them, to hear them, to value them. But more than her academic achievements or her future career plans, Maya had learned something invaluable that day in the Westridge Gymnasium. She'd learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to stand for what's right even when you're terrified. She'd learned that dignity can't be taken from you, only surrendered, and that refusing to surrender it is sometimes the most powerful act of resistance. She'd learned that change doesn't happen because systems suddenly decide to be better. It happens because individuals decide they won't accept anything less. What would you have done in Maya's position? Would you have kept your head down to avoid conflict, or would you have stood your ground like she did? Drop your answer in the comments below. The gymnasium at Westridge High still stands, of course. Students still play basketball there, still run drills, still learn the fundamentals of athleticism and teamwork. But the energy is different now. The culture is different. The expectations are different. Coach Waters has photos on her office wall, not of championships or awards but of students. Students of every background, every ability level, every body type, all of them looking proud and valued and seen. And in one corner of that wall is a small plaque that the students commissioned themselves. It reads, "To Maya Thompson, who showed us that standing up for yourself is the same thing as standing up for everyone. May we all have her courage." The school administration didn't approve it. The students didn't ask for permission. They just put it up one day, and when Dr. Thompson heard about it, she made it clear it was staying. Because that's what real change looks like. It's not just new policies and training sessions and amended handbooks. It's monuments to courage, reminders of why the change was necessary, commitments to never forget how bad things were so you can appreciate and maintain how much better they've become. The story of Maya Thompson and Coach Derek Mitchell spread far beyond Westridge High, far beyond that single district, far beyond even the educational community. It became a cultural touchstone, referenced in discussions about accountability, about racial justice in schools, about the power dynamics between adults and children, about what real safety looks like versus performative safety. News outlets ran follow-up stories a year later. Where are they now, the students who spoke up? Documentary filmmakers reached out, wanting to tell the story in depth. Think pieces were written about the incident, analyzing what it revealed about systemic failures in education, about how institutions protect their own at the expense of those they're meant to serve. But through it all, Maya stayed remarkably grounded. She didn't want to be famous. She didn't want to be a symbol. She just wanted to be treated fairly, and when that was denied, she'd responded with the integrity her mother had instilled in her. The rest, the reforms, the national attention, the lasting impact, that was just what happened when you insisted on truth in a system built on looking the other way. Sometimes one person really can change everything. Not because they're superhuman or uniquely gifted, but because they refuse to accept that things have to stay the way they are. Maya Thompson was just a 16-year-old girl who wanted a fresh start at a new school. She didn't set out to be a revolutionary. She didn't plan to expose systemic racism and abuse. She just showed up as herself, intelligent, athletic, dignified, and when someone tried to punish her for that, she stood her ground. And in standing her ground, she moved the earth. The sun was setting as Dr. Thompson finally left her office that day, 3 months after the incident that had changed everything. She walked through the now quiet hallways of the administrative building, past offices where new policies were being implemented, where new conversations were happening, where people were finally being held accountable for their actions. She thought about all the students who'd been harmed over the years when the system failed them, and she felt the weight of responsibility to make sure it never failed another. But she also felt hope. Because the students she'd met, the ones who'd testified at that board meeting, the ones who'd started advocacy groups and demanded better, they were the future. They weren't going to accept the status quo. They weren't going to stay silent in the face of injustice. They'd seen that speaking up could lead to real change, and they weren't going to forget that lesson. As Patricia drove home, past the school where her daughter had been assaulted, past the school where her daughter was now thriving, she thought about the conversation they'd had that morning in the car, all those months ago. Maya had asked to be treated normally, had asked Patricia to hide who she was. And Patricia had agreed, reluctantly, worried about what might happen. Something had happened. Something terrible. But also something transformative. Sometimes you have to expose the darkness before you can bring in the light. Sometimes you have to let the system reveal its failures before you can fix them. And sometimes the worst thing that could happen becomes the catalyst for the best changes you could imagine. Maya was waiting at home when Patricia arrived, working on homework at the kitchen table, looking like any other high school student on any other evening. Except she wasn't any other student. She was the girl who'd stared down injustice and refused to blink. She was the girl who'd turned her trauma into transformation. She was the girl who'd reminded an entire district that every student deserves dignity, safety, and respect. Patricia hugged her daughter, held her a little longer than usual, grateful beyond words that Maya was not just surviving but thriving, not just healing but helping others heal. This was what success looked like. Not test scores or graduation rates or awards and accolades. A young woman who'd faced darkness and emerged stronger, kinder, more committed to justice than ever before. The story of what happened in the Westridge High Gymnasium that day will be told for years to come. In teacher training sessions, in student assemblies, in education policy debates, in family conversations about standing up for what's right. It will be told because it matters, because it reveals truth, because it reminds us all that change is possible when we refuse to accept anything less. And at the center of that story will always be a 16-year-old girl with a bruised face and a bleeding knee who looked at a man twice her size and said with quiet conviction, "You had no right to touch me at all." 4 words that changed everything. 4 words that reminded everyone watching that power doesn't come from size or position or authority, it comes from knowing your worth and refusing to let anyone diminish it. That's the real lesson of Maya Thompson's story. Not that bad people exist, we already knew that. Not that systems fail, we've seen that over and over. The lesson is that courage is contagious, that standing in your truth gives others permission to stand in theirs, that one person refusing to be diminished can start a wave that lifts everyone. So to every student who's ever been made to feel less than, who's ever been targeted or humiliated or hurt by someone in authority, your voice matters. Your dignity matters. Your refusal to accept injustice matters. You don't need to be the superintendent's daughter to deserve respect. You deserve it because you're human. And when systems fail to recognize that, when people in power forget that, It's not just your right but your responsibility to remind them. Stand tall. Speak truth. Refuse to be diminished. Because you never know whose life you might change, what system you might transform, what future you might create simply by insisting that you, and everyone like you, deserve to be treated with dignity. That's the legacy of Maya Thompson. That's the story of Westridge High. That's the promise of what education can be when we finally get it right. And it all started with one girl who refused to stay silent, one mother who refused to let it go, and one moment when courage met power and changed everything.